In 2026, the world is closer to a global war than it has been at any point since 1945. That is not a theory. That is the documented assessment of the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which moved the Doomsday Clock to 89 seconds to midnight in January 2025, the closest it has ever stood to catastrophe in its entire 78-year history. Russia and Ukraine remain locked in the longest European land war since World War II, with no credible ceasefire in sight. China is conducting military exercises around Taiwan with a frequency and a scale that military analysts openly describe as rehearsals. The Middle East has drawn in regional powers and proxy forces in a conflict that shows no sign of cooling. And the United States, the world's most powerful military force, is simultaneously managing alliances across 3 theaters of war, while its relationship with China deteriorates by the month. This is the world in 2026. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, positioned at one of the most strategically valuable points on the entire planet, sits a small island that most people forget exists when they think about global warfare. An island that the world's largest military powers have never actually forgotten. An island that was already turned into a military base once before, within living memory. An island whose geography makes it almost impossible to ignore when the guns start firing. That island is Jamaica. And the question is not whether Jamaica would be involved in a third world war. The real question, the one nobody is publicly asking, is what Jamaica would become. Because when you study the history, the geography, and the cold military logic that governs how great powers think about small nations in wartime, the answer is deeply unsettling. Jamaica would not just be affected by a global war. Jamaica would be consumed by it, transformed by it, and the 2.8 million people who live there would have almost no say in what happens to their country. Here's what that actually looks like. To understand why Jamaica specifically would become one of the most contested pieces of territory in a global conflict, you have to understand what makes a location militarily valuable. It is not size. It is not population. It is not GDP or political influence or diplomatic relationships. It is position. In warfare, geography is destiny, and Jamaica's geography is extraordinary in ways that most people have never been told. Kingston Harbour, the natural harbor that sits along Jamaica's southern coastline, is the 7th largest natural harbor in the entire world. Let that land for a moment. The 7th largest natural harbor on Earth, on an island that most of the world thinks of only in terms of beaches, music, and tourism. Kingston Harbour is deep enough, wide enough, and strategically positioned well enough to accommodate some of the largest naval vessels ever constructed. In a global war, any military power with control of Kingston Harbour has an operational staging point for naval activity across the entire Western Atlantic. It is not just a harbor. In wartime terms, it is one of the most valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. But that is only the beginning of Jamaica's strategic profile. The island sits at what military planners call a choke point node, a position where multiple critical maritime routes converge. Every major shipping lane connecting North America, South America, and Europe passes through the waters surrounding Jamaica. The island is positioned such that a military force based there can monitor, intercept, or dominate commercial and naval traffic across a vast area of the Western Hemisphere. Any power that controls Jamaica during a global war controls the strategic high ground of the Caribbean Sea. And then there is the Panama Canal. The Panama Canal handles approximately 5 to 6% of all global trade. That figure sounds modest until you understand what it represents in wartime. The canal is the jugular vein of Western Hemisphere maritime commerce. It is the passage through which military equipment, fuel, food supplies, and weapons move between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. In a global conflict, the ability to control, threaten, or defend transit through the Panama Canal is one of the most consequential military capabilities a nation can have. And Jamaica, sitting within striking distance, within surveillance range, within operational reach of the canal's Atlantic approaches, would be the most logical forward base for any power seeking to influence what passes through those waters. This is not speculation. Military planners have understood this for over 80 years, and the evidence of that understanding is sitting right now in the Jamaican countryside, mostly forgotten, mostly overgrown, but structurally intact and waiting. In 1942, a full year after the United States entered World War II, the American military made a decision that tells you everything you need to know about how Jamaica was valued as a strategic asset. They built an airbase on the island, not in Cuba, not in Puerto Rico, not in the Bahamas, in Jamaica, in the parish of Clarendon, in the interior of the island, the United States constructed a military installation called Vernum Field. The base was built specifically because of Jamaica's geographic position. It allowed American aircraft to patrol the Caribbean Sea, to escort Allied convoys crossing these waters, and to intercept Axis operations across the region. Vernamfield was active throughout the war and was decommissioned only after the strategic threat had passed. But here is what makes the Vernamfield story so significant in 2026, over 80 years later. The base still exists, the infrastructure is still there, the runways are still there. And in recent years, there have been ongoing discussions involving Jamaican authorities and various international parties about what Vernamfield could become. The strategic logic that caused the United States to build it in 1942 has not changed. The geography has not changed. And in a world where global tensions are escalating to levels not seen since the Cold War at its most dangerous, Vernamfield is exactly the kind of ready-made strategic asset that military planners do not forget and do not permanently walk away from. And the reason why they never truly let it go is rooted in what happened the last time the Caribbean became a theater of war. In 1942, Germany launched Operation Neuland, a coordinated U-boat campaign targeting Allied shipping in the Caribbean Sea. The results were devastating and swift. German submarines prowled these waters with near-total impunity, and across the full course of the war, over 400 Allied ships were sunk across the Caribbean theater. Oil tankers, cargo vessels, supply ships destroyed. Supply chains collapsed. Economies on both sides of the Atlantic felt the consequences for years. The Caribbean, which most people assumed would be a safe backwater during a global conflict, became one of the most dangerous stretches of water on Earth within months. And it happened faster than anyone anticipated. Faster than governments could respond. Faster than civilian populations could adapt. In 2020, that speed would be even more extreme. Modern warfare does not unfold the way World War II did. There is no slow mobilization period, no months of diplomatic maneuvering before the first strike. In the age of hypersonic missiles, cyber attacks capable of disabling national infrastructure within hours, and AI-driven surveillance operating continuously and globally, the transition from escalating tension to wartime emergency could happen within days. Jamaica would not have weeks to prepare. It would have hours to react. Before we go further, if what you are hearing right now has your attention, if you are learning things about Jamaica and the Caribbean that almost nobody talks about, do one thing right now: subscribe. We are pushing toward 10,000 subscribers, and every single one of you watching this makes that possible. Hit subscribe, and let's keep going. Because what comes next is where this story gets truly serious. The economic collapse that would hit Jamaica in the first days of a global war would be unlike anything the island has ever experienced. Tourism in Jamaica accounts for a significant share of GDP and employs hundreds of thousands of people directly and indirectly, from hotel workers and resort staff to taxi drivers, craft vendors, restaurant owners, and tour operators. The moment a third world war becomes real, the moment international flights begin to be suspended, the moment cruise lines redirect or requisition their ships, the moment travel advisories reach their highest levels, that entire sector of Jamaica's economy evaporates. Not contracts, not slows down, evaporates. Overnight, there is no tourism industry during a world war. There are no leisure travelers when cities are burning. But that visible economic collapse, as devastating as it is not the most dangerous thing that happens to Jamaica when global war begins. Jamaica imports approximately 60 to 70% of its food: rice, wheat, cooking oil. A significant portion of the protein consumed daily across the island. All of it arrives through a global maritime shipping network that functions with extraordinary efficiency in peacetime, and that breaks down with extraordinary speed in wartime. Commercial shipping does not simply slow during a global conflict. It becomes dangerous, unpredictable, and ultimately impossible in certain corridors. Insurance rates for vessels operating in conflict-adjacent waters rise to levels that make commercial operation non-viable. Shipping companies reroute aggressively or cease operations entirely in high-risk zones. Governments commandeer vessels for military logistics purposes, removing them from commercial service. The result is that the food Jamaica depends on stops arriving, and it does not take long. Studies of Caribbean supply chain vulnerabilities have consistently found that island nations in the region could begin experiencing significant food shortages within weeks, not months, of a major global conflict disrupting maritime trade. For Jamaica, with its deep import dependency and its population of 2.8 million, the arithmetic is frightening. Think about what happened in March 2021 when the container ship Ever Given became lodged across the Suez Canal for just 6 days. One ship, one waterway. 6 days of no war, no deliberate targeting, no military campaign, and the disruption cascaded through global supply chains for months. Delayed deliveries, empty shelves, inflated prices across multiple continents. Now imagine not 6 days, but months or years of submarine warfare, naval blockades, and deliberate attacks on commercial shipping across multiple ocean corridors simultaneously. Jamaica does not survive that without running out of food. The question is only how quickly, and whether any external power steps in, and what they demand in return. Because outside intervention in wartime always comes with conditions. This is where the military base question stops to be abstract and becomes entirely concrete. There are exactly 3 global powers that would have both the motivation and the capability to intervene meaningfully in Jamaica during a Third World War, and each of them would want something specific in exchange. The first is the United States. The American relationship with Jamaica runs deep. Culturally, economically, and militarily, Jamaica and the United States formalized a status of forces agreement in 2019, establishing legal frameworks for U.S. military personnel to operate in Jamaica under defined conditions. Even in peacetime today, there are active Coast Guard cooperation programs, intelligence sharing arrangements, and joint counter-narcotics operations between the two countries. The American military presence in Jamaica is not a hypothetical. It already exists in a limited form. In a global war, the United States would have overwhelming strategic motivation to expand that presence dramatically. Vernamfield would be the obvious target. A ready-made airbase infrastructure on a strategically positioned island, connected to a country with which the U.S. already has an operational military relationship. What would Jamaica receive in exchange for formalizing that arrangement? Economic support, food aid, fuel supplies, military protection against threats the island could not otherwise defend itself against. What would Jamaica give up? Sovereignty over portions of its territory. The right to determine what flies out of Vernamfield and against whom. The ability to remain neutral. The capacity to say no to a partner whose military and economic power dwarfs Jamaica's entire gross domestic product. And neutrality, for a small island nation sitting at the center of a global war's strategic geography, is perhaps the most dangerous position of all. The second power with significant and growing interest in Jamaica is China. China's presence in Jamaica has expanded substantially over the past 2 decades. Chinese state-affiliated construction companies built the North-South Highway, one of the most significant pieces of modern infrastructure Jamaica has constructed since independence. Chinese investment has flowed into Jamaican ports, telecommunications networks, and real estate. In 2026, as the U.S.-China strategic competition has intensified across every domain, economic, technological, military, and now spatial, China's established foothold in Caribbean infrastructure has become a source of serious and documented concern for American defense planners. If a Third World War places the United States and China on opposing sides of a global conflict, Jamaica's existing Chinese infrastructure connections become an immediate strategic flashpoint, the question of which external power gains access to Kingston Harbour, with its deep anchorage and its proximity to the Panama Canal corridor, could become one of the most sharply contested questions of the early phase of a global war. Jamaica, a sovereign nation with limited military capacity and significant external debt, would find itself pressured simultaneously from multiple directions, each major power offering assistance, each one attaching conditions. Each one watching which way the island tilts and prepared to respond if it tilts the wrong way. The third power is the United Kingdom. Jamaica was a British colony until August 6, 1962. In 2024, Jamaica formally initiated the constitutional process of removing the British monarchy, a process still ongoing in 2026. But sovereignty transitions do not erase the security, relationships, intelligence sharing arrangements, and strategic interests that decades of association have built. Britain is a founding member of NATO. In any global conflict that activates NATO, and the current trajectory of tensions in Europe makes that scenario far from theoretical, Britain's established relationships across the Caribbean would be activated in ways that go well beyond current diplomatic links. The uncomfortable reality that sits beneath all 3 of these relationships is this. In a genuine global conflict, Jamaica's formal independence may provide very limited practical protection against the pressure of great power demands. Small nations caught between competing global powers in wartime rarely maintain full sovereignty. They maintain the appearance of sovereignty. They maintain the formal legal language of sovereignty. But the decisions that actually determine the fate of their territory are made in practice under enormous external pressure, often with timelines that make genuine deliberation impossible. And the 2.8 million Jamaicans who would live through that experience would bear the consequences of decisions made in Washington, Beijing, and London. Those consequences extend beyond economics and military positioning into territory that is deeply human. The Caribbean sits geographically between the United States and South America. In a major global conflict, both of those landmasses would generate massive refugee flows. When populations in major American cities face military threat, economic collapse, or the breakdown of civilian infrastructure under wartime stress, people move. They move south. They move toward water. They move toward any place that appears safer than where they are. Similarly, if South American nations are destabilized by conflict, economic crisis, or the catastrophic spillover effects of a war that disrupts the global financial system, northward refugee flows would converge precisely in the Caribbean basin. Jamaica, an island with 2.8 million people, already managing economic crisis and food insecurity, would receive refugee populations it was never designed to absorb. Hospitals built for a specific patient capacity, water treatment facilities calibrated for an existing population, housing stock built for people who already live there, all of it inadequate for a population that doubles or triples in weeks under wartime pressure. And when systems fail at that scale, social order follows. When food becomes genuinely scarce, when fuel is unavailable, when hospitals turn people away and government services collapse, the social contract that holds communities together does not hold. Civil unrest does not require ideology. It requires hunger, fear, and the visible failure of every institution people expected to protect them. The resilience of Jamaican communities is historically remarkable, but resilience has limits. The simultaneous convergence of economic collapse, food insecurity, military pressure, infrastructure failure, and refugee crisis exceeds what any community can absorb without serious fracture. But here is the dimension of this story that almost never gets told. The part that complicates the picture entirely. The part that changes what Jamaica's future in a global war could actually look like if the right decisions are made before the crisis arrives. Strategic value is a form of power. Jamaica, in a global war, would have more leverage than its size suggests. The very geography that makes Jamaica a target also makes Jamaica a negotiating asset, perhaps one of the most significant negotiating assets in the entire Caribbean region. Any major power that wants access to Kingston Harbour, to a reactivated Vernum Field, to Jamaica's surveillance and operational position over the Panama Canal approaches. That power needs Jamaica's genuine cooperation. Forced occupation is strategically messy, internationally costly, and practically difficult on an island whose civilian population can make military presence operationally complicated. Cooperation is far more valuable, and cooperation has a price. Small nations have historically been able to extract meaningful concessions from larger powers in exchange for strategic access during wartime. It has happened, but it requires preparation, a government with the diplomatic sophistication to understand what it has, the political courage to demand appropriate terms, and the international relationships to back that negotiating position with something more than words. In 2026, Jamaica does not yet appear to have had that conversation publicly, or with the urgency the current global situation demands. The Vernamfield question sits unanswered in public discourse. The Kingston Harbour strategic assessment is not a subject of national debate. The food security contingency plan for a maritime disruption scenario is not widely known. The refugee response capacity of the island has never been stress-tested against anything resembling what a global war would generate. These are not academic questions. In 2026, with the Doomsday Clock at 89 seconds to midnight, they are urgent ones. The world that built Vernamfield in 1942 did not ask Jamaica's permission. It simply arrived. The world of 2026 operates under different international norms, but the fundamental logic of great power behavior in wartime has not changed as much as we might want to believe. When national survival is at stake, powerful nations use every resource available, and Jamaica is a resource the world's most powerful nations have already demonstrated they will use. The Doomsday Clock is at 89 seconds to midnight. Russia's war in Europe has proven that major powers sustain years of devastating conflict for strategic objectives. The US-China competition is reshaping every region of the world. And in the center of all of it, Jamaica sits at the 7th largest natural harbor in the world, positioned over some of the most critical shipping corridors on the planet. With the infrastructure of a World War II airbase in Clarendon waiting, structurally ready, for the next time the world decides it needs it. The world has used Jamaica before. It will be prepared to use it again. The only question that truly matters for the 2.8 million people who call that island home is whether Jamaica will have any real say in the terms. Now we want to hear from you. If a third world war breaks out, should Jamaica allow foreign military bases on its soil? Would cooperating with a major power protect Jamaicans, or betray everything the islands sacrificed to gain independence in 1962? Is there a version of this where Jamaica leverages its strategic value to actually come out stronger? Drop your answer in the comments. This is a conversation that needs to happen, and it should be had by Caribbean people, not just analysts in Washington or Beijing, because the world is not waiting, and neither should Jamaica.